You may not hear the sounds of a sizzling steak as often this summer.
I am quite astounded at the prices, especially meat, in particular beef.
This shopper isn't alone.
You know, if it's not on sale, I just don't buy it. It's just too much money.
Beef prices have gone up quite significantly just since January.
Beef prices in particular have gone up substantially, but it's not just the beef prices. I literally just got off the phone with my turkey supplier about turkey breast for Thanksgiving. So his prices are up 80 to 90% over the last few weeks, a month or so.
Canada thought it could flex its muscles by slamming the door on American beef. A bold boycott, a political jab, and a message to Washington that Ottawa wouldn't be pushed around. But within weeks, the move turned into a disaster. Empty shelves, rising prices, and furious consumers who suddenly realized the cost of Carney's gamble. What was meant to be a patriotic stand quickly exposed the fragility of Canada's food system, where supply chains are already stretched thin and inflation is eating away at household budgets. Farmers saw chaos, grocers faced shortages, and shoppers were left asking one question: who in Ottawa thought this was a good idea? This isn't just about beef, it's about leadership, accountability, and the price of playing politics with people's dinner tables. If you're ready to uncover how this boycott collapsed, hit like, subscribe, and keep watching. When South River's beer store announced it was shutting its doors on November 16th, most people thought it was just another small-town casualty. But in reality, it was the 7th Northern Ontario site to close, following places like Sudbury, Madawaska, and Mattawa. One closure you could ignore. 7 in a year? That's a systemic collapse. The beer store monopoly, once untouchable, is shrinking fast, right as grocery and convenience stores are moving in on its territory. But this is where the boycott story gets complicated. Carney's government wasn't just taking a swing at American beef, it was also reshaping Ontario's alcohol retail system, and both moves collided in spectacular fashion.
So his prices are up 80 to 90% over the last few weeks, a month or so. And it's just more and more difficult for people to do so. And it's not just the beef, it's all the prices. But I think that, there's still, people have to eat.
As beer stores disappeared, the entire deposit return program, which processed 1.6 billion empty bottles and cans last year, suddenly landed in the laps of grocers. By January 1st, stores like Loblaws and Metro would be forced to take empties back, or risk losing the right to sell alcohol altogether. Picture it, a grocery store already dealing with supply shortages, inflation, and now suddenly mountains of stinking empties piled behind checkout lanes. Logistics costs skyrocketed overnight. Store managers warned that accepting beer bottles was one thing, but trying to process them alongside turkeys, beef, and fresh produce, that was a disaster waiting to happen. And yet Ottawa pushed forward. Enter Stanley Yanichuk, a local butcher who became the reluctant face of this crisis. Every week he pulls out invoices, comparing line by line, showing customers exactly how bad prices have gotten. Turkey? Up 80 to 90%. Beef? Surging, with no end in sight. His customers aren't just buying less, they're walking away entirely. Families that once bought steak on weekends are now settling for chicken thighs. Stanley puts it bluntly, two massive companies control the meat market, and Carney just gave them the power to squeeze Canadians harder. And here's the kicker, this wasn't supposed to happen. The boycott was meant to punish American ranchers, to signal strength in a trade dispute. Instead, it punished Canadian households. The US simply rerouted its beef to Asia and Europe. Prices dipped abroad, American producers shrugged, and Canada was left paying the bill. It was economic self-sabotage disguised as patriotism. Meanwhile, inflation crept higher. StatsCan reported consumer prices rose 1.9% in August, up from 1.7% in July. On paper, that might sound minor. But core inflation, the stuff consumers can't avoid, was at 2.6%. Groceries, utilities, and insurance were all climbing. Gasoline was technically down 12.7% from last year, but even that was weaker than July's 16.1% drop. Translation, relief at the pump was fading while the grocery aisle was turning into a battlefield.
Carney tried to project calm. He stood at podiums with his trademark steady hand tone, insisting these were short-term disruptions. But in butcher shops, diners, and family kitchens, nobody was buying it. People weren't looking for a lecture, they were looking for leadership. And what they saw, instead, was a prime minister who stacked crisis after crisis on top of one another. Beer store chaos, grocery recycling fiascos, beef shortages, and inflation pressure, all while claiming to be in control. This wasn't just an economic blunder, it was a political miscalculation that opened the door for critics to ask the obvious. If Trump's America First could secure lower prices for Americans, why couldn't Carney do the same for Canadians? Instead of unleashing Alberta's oil or supporting domestic ranchers, Carney chose to pick a fight Canada couldn't win. But that wasn't the whole story. Because just as consumers were adjusting to higher prices and fewer choices, the second phase of the crisis hit, and it would reveal just how unprepared Ottawa really was. The closures didn't stop with South River. As autumn dragged on, the wave spread south. Kitchener, London, Windsor, even parts of Toronto saw beer stores vanish. In just 12 months, more than a dozen locations were gone. Union reps scrambled to secure transfers or severance for laid-off workers, but the damage was bigger than jobs. These stores weren't just retailers. They were community fixtures, anchors for local recycling, and part of a system people had relied on for decades. The recycling fallout was staggering. Without beer stores, 1.6 billion empties had to go somewhere. Landfill started filling with aluminum and glass that were once profitably recycled. Grocers protested, warning that they had neither storage space nor staff to handle the tsunami of returns. Independent shops feared they'd be forced out of alcohol sales entirely. Even Metro executives admitted behind closed doors. The infrastructure wasn't ready, but Carney forced the deadline anyway. Meanwhile, families across Ontario were discovering the hidden cost of Ottawa's beef boycott. It wasn't just steaks or roasts. Everything from deli slices to frozen lasagna started climbing in price. Restaurants quietly raised menu prices. Pub owners scaled back portions. For small-town Canadians, this wasn't abstract economics. It was dinner. Stanley Yanichuk's weekly invoice checks became a symbol of resistance, proof that people weren't imagining the squeeze. And then came inflation's cruel twist. With food costs surging, the Bank of Canada faced a dilemma. Cut rates to stimulate growth? That risked fueling even higher grocery prices. Hold steady? That choked off borrowing and kept mortgages painfully high. It was a lose-lose scenario, and Carney was trapped in the middle. His calm, technocratic image, the adult in the room, began to unravel. Instead of stability, he looked flustered, delivering contradictory sound bites and blaming global factors for problems his own policies worsened. Critics pounced. Opposition leaders called him the worst prime minister in a generation. Editorials described a man flailing and throwing tantrums while households skipped meals to pay bills. Business leaders quietly admitted they missed Trump's clarity even when it came with chaos. America first had delivered supply security and lower prices. Canada, under Carney, seemed addicted to self-inflicted wounds. The boycott itself was the clearest example. Washington barely noticed. U.S. ranchers rerouted shipments to Asia, pocketed subsidies, and moved on. But Canada? Farmers got squeezed, grocers raised prices, and consumers revolted. It was a textbook case of what happens when symbolism replaces strategy. Ottawa tried to make a statement. Instead, it exposed just how fragile Canada's food and retail systems really were. And the ripple effects didn't stop at the grocery store. Breweries relying on recycled glass faced shortages. Municipalities paid more for landfill management. Small towns lost not just jobs, but community hubs. Every problem stacked on the next, like dominoes falling one by one, all leading back to Carney's desk. The irony? Alberta's ranchers and oil producers were begging for support. A government willing to unleash domestic supply could have shielded Canadians from global shocks. Instead, Carney chose confrontation abroad and dysfunction at home. By boycotting U.S. beef, he triggered shortages without creating any backup plan. By dismantling the beer store monopoly without preparing grocers, he triggered chaos in recycling and alcohol sales. It was leadership by gamble, and the country lost. The public mood shifted fast. Polls showed trust in Carney collapsing. The once calm, technocratic banker was now portrayed as a liability. If Trump could lower beef prices for American families, why can't Carney keep Canadian shelves stocked? It was a brutal comparison, and it stuck. So where does this leave Canada? A boycott that was supposed to show strength ended up showing weakness. Families paid more, small towns lost jobs, recycling fell apart, and inflation ticked higher, all while Washington barely blinked. This wasn't leadership. This was politics played with people's dinner tables, and Canadians paid the price. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Unless leadership changes course, the next crisis will be worse. Food, energy, housing, nothing is safe from the ripple effects of mismanagement. And if Ottawa doesn't wake up, affordability will collapse completely. That's why it's time to demand accountability. Time to replace political games with business-friendly policies that actually deliver. Alberta's oil, Canadian ranchers, and hardworking families deserve better. If you believe Canadians shouldn't suffer because of Ottawa's experiments, hit like, share this video, and subscribe.
Because the only way change happens is if we force it.